The summer sun beat down on Oakhaven with a relentless, almost oppressive heat, baking the asphalt roads and turning the usually vibrant green of the surrounding forests into a dusty, muted olive. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the ground, distorting the distant tree line into an undulating mirage. Despite the sweltering conditions, Sarah felt a familiar thrill of anticipation as she surveyed the dig site. This was it. The culmination of months of planning, grant applications, and countless hours poring over dusty historical records. Oakhaven, a town so unremarkable it barely registered on most maps, held a secret, she was convinced. Secret buried deep beneath the foundations of its original, long-lost church. Her team, small but dedicated, moved with a practiced efficiency that spoke of shared experiences under less than ideal circumstances. Mark, the pragmatic archaeologist, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand, his movements precise as he carefully brushed away layers of soil from a section of crumbling stone. He was a man of logic, of tangible evidence, and his skepticism was a constant grounding force against Sarah's more intuitive leaps of faith. Emily, on the other hand, was pure, unadulterated enthusiasm. A geology student with an almost childlike wonder for the Earth's hidden mysteries, she hummed a tuneless melody as she meticulously sifted through buckets of excavated dirt, her eyes bright with the promise of discovery. The initial days of the dig were, as expected, mundane. They unearthed fragments of pottery, rusted tools, and the occasional skeletal remains of small animals, the usual detritus of centuries of human habitation. Each find, no matter how small, was meticulously cataloged, photographed, and bagged. The rhythm of the work was hypnotic. The rhythmic scrape of trowels against earth, the soft whisper of brushes, the occasional clink of metal on stone. It was a dance they knew well, a slow, patient unveiling of the past. But as the days bled into weeks and the excavation deepened, a subtle shift began to occur. The air, already heavy with humidity, seemed to grow denser, charged with an unspoken tension. The usual chirping of cicadas, a constant backdrop to Oakhaven summers, grew strangely muted, replaced by an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth itself. Sarah found herself pausing more often, listening, her senses heightened, a prickling unease crawling up her spine. She dismissed it as fatigue, the relentless heat, the pressure of the dig. Then came the afternoon of the unearthing. The sun, usually a benevolent presence, felt like a malevolent eye in the sky, its rays piercing through the canopy of trees with an almost surgical precision. Emily, working in the deepest section of the trench, let out a sudden, sharp gasp that cut through the quiet hum of the dig. Sarah and Mark immediately converged on her, their faces etched with concern. Emily was kneeling, her hands hovering over a section of freshly exposed earth. Her eyes, usually so bright, were wide with a mixture of awe and something akin to fear. "Sarah, Mark, you need to see this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Beneath the crumbling remnants of the church's foundation, where only compacted earth and ancient stone should have been, lay something else entirely. It was a rock formation, unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Its surface was smooth, almost polished, with an unnatural, obsidian-like sheen. But it was the color that truly captivated her, a deep, swirling violet that seemed to absorb the light around it, yet simultaneously pulsed with an internal glow. A faint, rhythmic light, like a slow, steady heartbeat, emanated from its depths, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the walls of the trench. It was alien, utterly out of place, and profoundly unsettling. Mark, ever the pragmatist, knelt beside Emily, his brow furrowed in concentration. He reached out a gloved hand, hesitated, then touched the surface of the stone. He recoiled almost immediately, a low grunt escaping his lips. "It's cold," he muttered, his voice laced with a strange mix of disbelief and unease. "Unnaturally cold." Sarah, her historian's curiosity overriding her growing apprehension, reached out and touched it herself. The surface was indeed cold, but it was more than that. It felt alive. A faint vibration hummed beneath her fingertips, a low, guttural thrum that resonated deep within her bones. It was a sensation that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. This was no ordinary rock. This was something ancient, something powerful, something that defied all known geological classifications. What was this strange rock, and why was it here, buried beneath the foundations of a forgotten church in an unremarkable town like Oakhaven? The question hung in the humid air, heavy with unspoken implications. The discovery of the pulsating violet stone had cast a long, unsettling shadow over the dig site. Mark, Ever the pragmatist tried to rationalize it, muttering about unusual mineral deposits and geothermal anomalies, but even his voice lacked its usual conviction. Emily, usually so effervescent, was strangely subdued, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and a nascent fear. Sarah, however, felt a pull towards the stone, an almost magnetic fascination that transcended scientific curiosity. It defied all known geological classifications, its very existence a challenge to everything she understood about the Earth. That evening, back in their makeshift lab set up in the dusty, disused town hall, Sarah found herself drawn to the small sample she had carefully chipped off the larger formation. It sat on a sterile white cloth, a dark, smooth shard of violet that seemed to absorb the dim light of the single overhead bulb. The faint, rhythmic pulse was still there, a subtle thrum that she could feel more than see. Mark and Emily had gone back to their rented rooms, exhausted by the day's heat and the unsettling discovery. Sarah, however, couldn't rest. The stone called to her. She picked up the sample, its surface unnaturally cold against her fingertips. As she held it, a faint, rhythmic whisper began to emanate from it, just at the edge of audibility. It was a low, guttural hum, a sound that resonated deep within her bones, vibrating through her very being. It wasn't a language she recognized, yet it felt strangely familiar, like a half-forgotten dream. The whispers seemed to be calling to her, a soft, insistent murmur that promised secrets, knowledge, something ancient and profound. Sarah pressed the stone to her ear, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of indistinct voices that seemed to swirl and coalesce around her. She could almost make out words, fragments of a forgotten tongue, but they slipped away like smoke, just beyond her grasp. Was she imagining it? Was the exhaustion, the stress of the dig finally getting to her? Or was the stone truly alive, communicating with her? She spent hours like this, lost in the strange, hypnotic rhythm of the whispers, her mind a battlefield between scientific skepticism and a growing, unsettling belief. The air in the lab grew colder, a chill that had nothing to do with evening temperature. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision, shifting and swirling, taking on fleeting, distorted shapes. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if her own consciousness was slowly drifting away, replaced by something ancient and vast. A sudden, sharp crack from the stone sample startled her, pulling her back to reality. A thin, almost invisible fissure had appeared on its surface, a hairline fracture that pulsed with a faint internal light. The whispers intensified, becoming more urgent, more demanding. Sarah dropped the stone, her hands trembling. It landed on the cloth with a soft thud, the whispers immediately fading, leaving behind only the oppressive silence of the lab. She stared at the stone, her mind racing. It was alive, it was communicating, and it was changing. The fissure, though small, was a clear indication that the stone was reacting to something, perhaps to her presence, perhaps to the very act of being unearthed. The implications were terrifying. If this small sample was so potent, what about the vast formation buried beneath the church? Sarah knew she had to tell Mark and Emily, but a part of her hesitated. They would dismiss it, rationalize it away. They would think she was losing her mind. But she couldn't keep this to herself. The whispers, the cold, the feeling of something ancient stirring beneath the earth. It was too real, too profound to ignore. The question lingered in the cold, silent air of the lab. Was she imagining it, or was the stone alive? And if it was, what did it want? The morning after her unsettling encounter with the whispering stone, Sarah felt a desperate urgency to share her experience with Mark and Emily. She found them at the dig site, already hard at work, the rhythmic scrape of their tools a familiar, comforting sound that momentarily lulled her into a false sense of normalcy. She approached them, the small violet sample clutched tightly in her hand, its coldness a constant reminder of the night's events. "You won't believe what happened last night," she began, her voice a little too high, a little too eager. She recounted the faint hum, the rhythmic whispers, the chilling sensation of the stone vibrating in her hand, and the sudden, almost imperceptible fissure that had appeared on its surface. She watched their faces as she spoke, searching for any sign of recognition, any flicker of understanding. Mark, ever the pragmatist, listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Sarah, you've been working non-stop since we got here. The heat, the pressure of the dig, it's easy for the mind to play tricks on you when you're exhausted. It's probably just some piezoelectric effect, or a resonance from the earth. The fissure? Natural stress fracture." His words were calm, logical, and utterly dismissive. He offered her a sympathetic smile, the kind reserved for someone who was clearly overworked and overtired. Emily, usually so quick to embrace the unusual, seemed to defer to Mark's scientific authority. She offered a hesitant, "Maybe you just need some rest, Sarah. We can take a look at it later with the proper equipment." Her eyes, however, held a flicker of something Sarah couldn't quite decipher. Was it concern, or was it a subtle, almost imperceptible fear? Sarah felt a surge of frustration, a hot, bitter wave that threatened to overwhelm her. They didn't believe her. They couldn't see what she saw, couldn't hear what she heard. The stone, still cold and faintly humming in her palm, felt like a burden, a secret she was forced to carry alone. She retreated from the dig site, the rhythmic scraping of their tools now a grating, irritating sound that mocked her growing conviction. Determined to find answers, Sarah abandoned the dig site for the dusty archives of Oakhaven's small, neglected town library. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper and forgotten stories, a comforting aroma that usually soothed her. Today, it felt charged with a different kind of energy, a sense of hidden histories waiting to be unearthed. She delved into old town records, brittle newspapers, and faded personal journals, searching for any mention of strange occurrences, unusual geological formations, or anything that might shed light on the violet stone. The early records of Oakhaven were sparse, filled with mundane details of land deeds and birth certificates. But as she dug deeper, she began to uncover fragmented accounts, whispers of a darker past. There were mentions of unexplained disappearances, particularly of children, in the late 1800s. Local folklore spoke of a pervasive, unspoken fear among the early settlers, a dread that seemed to emanate from the very land beneath the town. One journal entry, written in a shaky, almost illegible hand, spoke of the hum from below and the hungry earth. Another mentioned sacrifices to keep the darkness sleeping. Sarah's heart pounded as she pieced together the fragments. There were recurring themes, a deep, resonant sound from underground, a strange light that pulsed in the night, and a chilling sense of something ancient stirring beneath Oakhaven. The accounts were vague, often dismissed as superstition or the ramblings of isolated, fearful people, but taken together, they painted a disturbing picture. The disappearances were never solved, the fear never truly articulated, only hinted at in hushed tones and veiled warnings. She found a series of old maps, hand-drawn and crudely rendered, that showed the original layout of Oakhaven. What struck her was a recurring symbol, a strange, intricate spiral, often drawn near the location of the old church and sometimes, chillingly, near the homes of those who had disappeared. It was a symbol she had never encountered in any historical text, a design that felt alien and ancient. The library closed its doors, but Sarah continued her research by the dim light of her phone, her mind racing, connecting the dots between the whispers from the stone, the strange occurrences in Oakhaven's past, and the pervasive unease that now clung to the town like a shroud. What dark secrets did Oakhaven hide? And what did they have to do with the pulsating stone beneath the church? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last, pulling her deeper into the town's forgotten history. As the archaeological dig progressed, the strange, violet rock formation beneath the church continued to expand, revealing itself to be not a singular anomaly, but a vast, intricate network of pulsating stone that stretched far beyond the initial excavation site. Mark, despite his earlier skepticism, found himself increasingly fascinated, his pragmatic mind struggling to reconcile the tangible evidence before him with any known geological principles. Emily, on the other hand, seemed almost mesmerized by the stone, spending hours simply observing its faint, rhythmic glow, her usual effervescence replaced by a quiet, almost reverent intensity. The changes weren't confined to the dig site. A subtle, yet pervasive shift began to ripple through Oakhaven itself. The townspeople, usually apathetic to the comings and goings of outsiders, began to exhibit a growing unease. It started subtly, with increased irritability and a general air of tension that hung heavy in the summer air. Small arguments erupted in the general store. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades found themselves snapping at each other over trivial matters, and a pervasive sense of anxiety settled over the once sleepy community. Then came the nightmares, vivid, disturbing dreams that plagued the sleep of nearly everyone in Oakhaven. People woke up in cold sweats, their minds filled with fragmented images of dark, swirling shapes, guttural whispers, and a crushing sense of being buried alive. The nightmares were so widespread, so similar in their unsettling themes, that they became a common topic of conversation at the local diner, whispered over lukewarm coffee and stale donuts. A collective fear began to take root, a fear that had no name, no tangible source, yet was undeniably present. The townspeople also developed a growing aversion to the dig site. What had once been a curiosity, a minor distraction, now became a place to be avoided. Children, who had previously played near the perimeter, were now strictly forbidden from approaching it. Adults would cross the street to avoid walking past the old church, their gazes averted, their steps quickened. A palpable sense of dread emanated from the excavation, a silent warning that seemed to resonate with the town's growing unease. Old Man Hemlock, a reclusive local who lived in a dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of town, was the first to voice the unspoken fears. He was a figure of local legend, a man who rarely left his property, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and sun-baked wisdom. One sweltering afternoon, he appeared at the edge of the dig site, his eyes, usually clouded with age, sharp and piercing as they fixed on Sarah. "You're disturbing what lies sleeping," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He was clutching a gnarled walking stick, his knuckles white. This town, it was built on something old, something that should stay buried. Sarah, intrigued by his sudden appearance and cryptic warning, tried to engage him to ask him what he meant, but he simply shook his head, his gaze sweeping over the pulsating stone with a look of profound sorrow and fear. "Some things are best left alone," he muttered, his voice barely audible, before turning and disappearing back into the dense foliage from which he had emerged. His words, combined with the escalating unease in Oakhaven, sent a chill down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat. What was causing the town's growing unease? Was it simply mass hysteria, a collective delusion fueled by the strange discovery? Or was it something more insidious, something emanating from the ancient stone itself, a silent, unseen influence that was slowly, inexorably tightening its grip on the town? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last, pulling her deeper into the town's forgotten history and its present-day torment. The manifestation of the shadowy figure had shattered Sarah's last vestiges of scientific skepticism. What she had witnessed was beyond any rational explanation, a chilling confirmation that something ancient and malevolent was indeed stirring beneath Oakhaven. The pulsating violet stone was not merely a geological anomaly, it was a conduit, a gateway, and its influence was no longer confined to the dig site. The first signs of its spreading reach were subtle, almost imperceptible. Small, almost microscopic, fragments of the violet stone began to appear in unexpected places around Oakhaven. Emily, with her keen geological eye, was the first to notice them, a faint, almost invisible shimmer in the town's water supply, a tiny, almost imperceptible speck embedded in the bark of an old oak tree, a minuscule shard glinting in the dust of a basement floor. Each discovery sent a fresh wave of dread through Sarah. The stone was spreading, its tendrils reaching out, silently, insidiously, into the very fabric of the town. Then came the more overt manifestations. The townspeople's behavior, already marked by increased irritability and vivid nightmares, grew more erratic, more disturbing. Collective hallucinations became commonplace. People would stop in the middle of the street, their eyes wide and vacant, staring at something only they could see. They would point at empty spaces, whispering about the hum in the light. A chilling, shared delusion began to take hold, a pervasive belief that something was calling to them from below, a silent, insistent summons that resonated deep within their minds. Sarah witnessed it firsthand at the local diner. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet, elderly woman who had lived in Oakhaven her entire life, suddenly dropped her coffee cup, her eyes fixed on the floor. "It's calling," she whispered, her voice raspy with fear, "from beneath the earth. It's calling us home." Other patrons, who had been engaged in their own conversations, slowly turned their heads, their eyes glazed over, their faces pale. A low, guttural hum, almost imperceptible, filled the diner, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards. Sarah felt it too, a vibration that resonated deep within her bones, a silent, insistent pull towards the earth. The town was no longer safe. The subtle unease had escalated into a pervasive, suffocating dread. People began to barricade their doors at night, not against human intruders, but against something unseen, something that whispered from the darkness. The once bustling town square became deserted after dusk, the only sounds the mournful howl of the wind and the distant, unsettling hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah, Mark, and Emily found themselves increasingly isolated. Their scientific explanations, once a source of comfort, now seemed laughably inadequate against the terrifying reality unfolding around them. Mark, ever the pragmatist, tried to find a logical explanation for the spreading stone, for the collective hallucinations, for the pervasive fear. He collected samples, ran tests, but the results were always the same. The stone defied all known classifications, and the townspeople's symptoms defied all known medical diagnoses. Emily, however, seemed to be drawn to the spreading stone, her fascination bordering on obsession. She would spend hours collecting samples, her fingers tracing the faint violet veins that now appeared in the most unexpected places. Sarah watched her with growing concern, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Emily was changing, her usual effervescence replaced by a quiet, almost reverent intensity. Her eyes, once bright and curious, now held a strange, distant look, as if she were seeing something beyond the veil of reality. The question that haunted Sarah's waking hours was chilling in its simplicity. How far had its influence spread? Was it confined to Oakhaven, or was it reaching out, silently, insidiously, to the world beyond? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. If this ancient entity was truly waking up, if its influence was spreading, then Oakhaven was just beginning, and the world, oblivious to the horror stirring beneath its feet, was utterly unprepared. The subtle hum that had permeated Oakhaven, once barely perceptible, had now intensified, becoming a low, constant thrum that vibrated through the very air, a sound that seemed to emanate from the ground beneath their feet. It was no longer just a feeling, it was a tangible presence, a pervasive hum that resonated deep within their bones, a silent, insistent summons that promised secrets, knowledge, something ancient and profound. For Sarah, the whispers she had first heard from the small stone sample now became distinct, coherent voices. They spoke in an ancient, guttural language, a series of clicks, hisses, and low, resonant tones that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to her mind. Yet, to her horror, she found herself understanding fragments, words of hunger and awakening, of ancient power and insatiable desire. The voices were not just in her lab anymore. They seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath Oakhaven, from the walls of the town hall, from the air itself. They were everywhere, a constant, insidious presence that slowly eroded her sanity. "We hunger," the voices hissed, a chorus of dry, rustling leaves. "We awaken. We consume." She tried to block them out, to focus on her research, on the mundane details of her work, but they were relentless, a constant, insidious presence that slowly eroded her sanity. She started talking to herself, her own voice a comforting presence in the oppressive silence. She left the radio on, the cheerful, mindless chatter of the local station, a flimsy shield against the encroaching darkness. But the voices always find a way to cut through, to slither into her ears and poison her thoughts. They mocked her, they taunted her, they whispered her deepest fears in the dead of night. Emily, too, began to hear them. At first she dismissed it as fatigue, as Sarah had. But as the voices grew louder, more distinct, her scientific skepticism began to crumble. She became increasingly withdrawn, her usual effervescence replaced by a quiet, almost reverent intensity. She spent hours simply listening, her eyes wide and vacant, as if she were seeing something beyond the veil of reality. She started sketching the patterns she saw in the stone, intricate spirals and geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with an internal light. Her sketches became more and more complex, more and more disturbing, filled with images of distorted figures in swirling darkness. Sarah watched her with growing concern, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Emily was changing, her usual bright curiosity replaced by a chilling obsession. She would spend hours simply listening, her fingers lingering on the cold, smooth surface of the stone. She started speaking in the guttural language of the entity, her voice no longer her own, but a distorted echo of the whispers that filled the air. "It calls to me, Sarah," Emily whispered one night, her eyes fixed on the pulsating stone sample in the lab. "It promises knowledge, it promises truth." Sarah tried to pull her away, to reason with her, but Emily resisted, her strength surprising. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and her eyes, once bright and curious, now held a strange, distant look, as if she were seeing something beyond the veil of reality. The question that haunted Sarah's waking hours was chilling in its simplicity. Were the voices real, or was their sanity unraveling? Was the entity truly communicating with them, or was it simply a manifestation of their own growing paranoia, a collective delusion fueled by the pervasive fear that had gripped Oakhaven? The thought terrified her more than anything else. The idea of losing her mind, of being trapped in a world of her own making, is a fate worse than death, and she knew with a chilling certainty that Emily was already halfway there. The escalating madness in Oakhaven, coupled with Emily's disturbing transformation, fueled Sarah's desperate search for answers. The scientific explanations offered by Mark, once a comforting anchor in a sea of uncertainty, now felt woefully inadequate. The whispers, the collective hallucinations, the pervasive dread, these were not symptoms of mass hysteria or geological anomalies. This was something ancient, something malevolent, something that defied all rational explanation. Driven by a desperate need to understand, Sarah returned to the dusty archives of Oakhaven's small, neglected town library. The familiar scent of old paper and forgotten stories, once a comfort, now felt charged with a different kind of energy, a sense of hidden histories waiting to be unearthed. She bypassed the usual historical records, her gaze drawn to a section of the library she had overlooked before, a hidden, forgotten alcove tucked away behind a towering shelf of outdated encyclopedias. It was dark, dusty, and smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic and ancient. Within this alcove, she discovered a collection of forbidden texts and journals bound in brittle leather and filled with faded, almost illegible script. These were not the official records of Oakhaven, but the secret chronicles of its earliest, most secretive settlers. They spoke of a time before the town, when the land was wild and untamed, and a cosmic entity slumbered beneath the earth. They called it the Elder One, a being of immense power that fed on fear and consciousness, a hungry void that threatened to consume all. Sarah's heart pounded as she devoured the texts, her fingers tracing the faded ink, her mind struggling to comprehend the terrifying truths contained within their pages. The journals detailed elaborate rituals performed by the early settlers, complex ceremonies of containment designed to keep the Elder One dormant. They spoke of intricate symbols carved into stone, of guttural chants whispered under the pale moonlight, of offerings made to appease the hungry entity. The language was archaic, filled with archaic terms and veiled metaphors, but the meaning was clear. These people knew about the Elder One. They had lived with its presence, and they had found a way to keep it at bay. But then the texts hinted at a terrible shift. The rituals became more frequent, the offerings more demanding. There were fragmented accounts of the great hunger, of the Elder One stirring in its slumber, its influence spreading, its whispers growing louder, and then, abruptly, the rituals ceased. The journals ended, their final entries filled with a chilling sense of despair and resignation. Why were these rituals abandoned? What happened to the settlers who performed them? The questions swirled in Sarah's mind, each one more unsettling than the last. She found crude drawings of the violet stone depicted as a vast, intricate network of pulsating veins that spread throughout the earth beneath Oakhaven. The drawings were accompanied by chilling descriptions of its influence, the way it twisted minds, induced nightmares, and slowly, insidiously, drained the life force from the land. It was a parasitic relationship, a slow, agonizing drain on the life force of the town. Sarah spent hours in the hidden alcove, lost in the terrifying history of Oakhaven, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of moonlight that pierced the gloom. The air grew colder, and she could almost hear the faint, guttural hum of the Elder One, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very pages of the ancient texts. She was no longer just a historian. She was a witness, a reluctant participant in a cosmic horror that had been unfolding for centuries. Mark, the pragmatic archaeologist, had remained steadfast in his skepticism, attributing the strange occurrences in Oakhaven to mass hysteria, a collective delusion fueled by the unsettling discovery of the violet stone. He clung to his scientific detachment like a lifeline, meticulously collecting samples, running tests, and searching for any logical explanation for the spreading stone, for the collective hallucinations, for the pervasive fear that had gripped the town. He dismissed Sarah's increasingly frantic theories about ancient entities and whispering stones as the product of an overactive imagination, a mind strained by the pressures of the dig. But even Mark, with his unwavering commitment to logic and reason, could not deny the tangible evidence that was slowly, inexorably, accumulating around them. The violet stone, now exposed in vast sections beneath the church, pulsed with an undeniable internal light, its rhythmic thrum a constant, unsettling presence. The townspeople's behavior grew more erratic, more disturbing, their eyes wide and vacant, their whispers filled with a chilling, shared delusion. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun beat down on the dig site with a relentless intensity, Mark found himself working in the deepest section of the trench, meticulously excavating a particularly large, pulsating section of the ancient rock. He was alone, the rest of the team having retreated to the shade for a much-needed break. the air around the stone was noticeably colder, a damp, stagnant chill that seeped into his bones even under the oppressive heat. The faint hum that emanated from the stone seemed to intensify, vibrating through the very earth beneath his feet. He reached out a gloved hand, his movements precise and deliberate, to brush away a layer of clinging soil from the surface of the stone. His fingers, calloused and accustomed to the rough textures of ancient artifacts, made contact with the smooth, unnaturally cold surface. He recoiled almost immediately, a sharp gasp escaping his lips. His face, usually impassive, was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. He stumbled backward, tripping over a loose rock, and landed hard on the dusty ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's cold," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes fixed on the pulsating stone. "Unnaturally cold. And I felt something, a cold, hungry intelligence. It reached into my mind, Sarah. It reached into my mind." Sarah, who had rushed over at the sound of his gasp, knelt beside him, her hand on his arm. His skin was clammy, his body trembling. His scientific detachment had shattered, replaced by a raw, primal fear that was chilling to witness. He was no longer the pragmatic archaeologist. He was a man who had come face to face with something that defied all logic, all reason, all understanding. He tried to explain what he had felt, what he had seen, not with his eyes, but with his mind. A vast ancient consciousness, hungry and malevolent, stirring in its slumber, a void that threatened to consume all. He spoke of images, fragmented and terrifying, of a world before time, of endless darkness and a crushing sense of despair. He spoke of whispers, not just in his ears, but in his very thoughts, promising knowledge, power, and ultimate oblivion. Sarah listened, her heart pounding in her chest, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. His words were a chilling confirmation of her own experiences, a validation of her growing paranoia. Mark, the unwavering skeptic, had finally seen the truth, and the truth was terrifying. What did Mark truly experience? Was it a direct communication from the Elder One, a glimpse into its ancient malevolent consciousness? Or was it simply the final, devastating blow to his carefully constructed reality, a descent into the same madness that had gripped the rest of Oakhaven? The questions swirled in Sarah's mind, each one more unsettling than the last, pulling her deeper into the town's forgotten history and its present-day torment. The dig site, once a place of scientific discovery, had become a battleground, and the lines between reality and nightmare were blurring with terrifying speed. Oakhaven, once a sleepy, unremarkable town, had descended into chaos. The subtle unease that had permeated the community had escalated into a pervasive, suffocating dread, a tangible presence that clung to every street, every building, every soul. The townspeople, fully under the entity's influence, began to act out their nightmares, their behavior growing more erratic, more disturbing with each passing day. They gathered in silent, unnerving crowds in the town square, their eyes wide and vacant, fixed on the ground as if mesmerized by something only they could see. They would stand for hours, motionless, their faces pale and drawn, their bodies swaying almost imperceptibly to a rhythm only they could hear. Sometimes they would engage in strange ritualistic behaviors, their movements slow and deliberate, their hands tracing intricate patterns in the air, their voices murmuring in a guttural language that was both ancient and terrifying. It was a chilling spectacle, a silent collective madness that had consumed the entire town. The whispers, once confined to Sarah's lab and the dig site, were now audible to everyone, a low, constant hum that permeated the very air, a sound that seemed to emanate from the ground beneath their feet, from the walls of their homes, from the very fabric of Oakhaven itself. It was a sound that promised secrets, knowledge, something ancient and profound, but also something hungry, something malevolent. The town was no longer safe. The subtle unease had escalated into a pervasive, suffocating dread. People began to barricade their doors at night, not against human intruders, but against something unseen, something that whispered from the darkness. The once bustling town square became deserted after dusk, the only sounds the mournful howl of the wind and the distant unsettling hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah, Mark, and Emily found themselves increasingly isolated. Their scientific explanations, once a source of comfort, now seemed laughably inadequate against the terrifying reality unfolding around them. Mark, his skepticism shattered by his own encounter with the entity, was a shadow of his former self, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with a constant unspoken fear. Emily, mesmerized by the stone, was slowly slipping away, her mind consumed by the whispers, her body becoming a vessel for the entity's will. The town's descent into madness was swift and brutal. The local authorities, overwhelmed and bewildered, were powerless to stop it. The few who tried to intervene were met with blank stares, their words falling on deaf ears. Some simply disappeared, swallowed by the growing darkness that had consumed Oakhaven. Others succumbed to the madness, joining the silent, swaying crowds in the town square, their eyes vacant, their minds lost to the entity's influence. Sarah watched in horror as her world crumbled around her. The town she had come to study, to understand, was being devoured by something ancient and unspeakable. The people she had come to know, to care for, were becoming mere husks, their consciousnesses slowly being absorbed by the Elder One. She felt its tendrils reaching for her own mind, a cold, insidious presence that promised ultimate knowledge in exchange for her soul. She fought it, clinging to the last vestiges of her sanity, but it was a losing battle. The entity is relentless, a constant, insidious presence that is slowly eroding her mind, piece by agonizing piece. The question that haunted Sarah's waking hours was chilling in its simplicity. How can they stop this collective madness? How can they fight something that is not physical, something that exists only in the shadows, in the static, in the darkest corners of their minds? It was a battle they were destined to lose, a game they could not win, and the entity knew it. It reveled in their fear, in their despair, in their growing madness. It was a cruel, twisted game, and Oakhaven was its playground. The chaos in Oakhaven intensified, a swirling vortex of fear and madness that threatened to consume everything. The townspeople, now mere husks of their former selves, wandered the streets with vacant eyes, their bodies swaying to the rhythm of the pervasive hum that emanated from the earth. They were no longer individuals, but a collective, their minds absorbed by the Elder One, their consciousnesses slowly being drained, leaving behind only empty vessels. Emily, however, was different. Her transformation was not one of passive absorption, but of active, terrifying change. She had been increasingly drawn to the violet stone, her fascination bordering on obsession. She would spend hours simply observing its faint, rhythmic glow, her usual effervescence replaced by a quiet, almost reverent intensity. Now, that intensity had morphed into something chillingly alien. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, as if the very life force was being leached from her body. Her veins, once a network of blue beneath her skin, now pulsed with a faint violet light, mirroring the glow of the ancient stone. Her eyes, once bright and curious, had become wide and vacant, reflecting the pulsating light of the ancient stone. Their pupils dilated, her gaze fixed on something beyond the veil of reality. She no longer spoke in coherent sentences, but in the guttural language of the entity, her voice no longer her own, but a distorted echo of the whispers that filled the air. Sarah watched her with growing horror, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Emily was slipping away, her mind consumed by the whispers, her body becoming a vessel for the entity's will. One afternoon, Sarah found Emily at the dig site, kneeling before a particularly large section of the violet stone, her hands pressed against its cold, smooth surface. Her body was trembling, her eyes wide and vacant, and a faint, violet light pulsed beneath her skin, mirroring the glow of the stone. "Emily!" Sarah cried, rushing towards her, a desperate plea in her voice. "What are you doing?" Emily turned her head slowly, her eyes fixed on Sarah, but there was no recognition in them, only a chilling, alien emptiness. "It calls to me, Sarah," she rasped, her voice a distorted echo of the whispers that filled the air. "It promises knowledge. It promises truth. It promises unity." As she spoke, her body began to contort, her limbs twisting at unnatural angles, her bones groaning in protest. The faint violet light beneath her skin intensified, and her hands, pressed against the stone, seemed to melt, to merge with its surface. She was attempting to physically merge with the rock formations, to become one with the Elder One, to join its collective consciousness. Sarah tried to pull her away, to reason with her, but Emily resisted, her strength surprising, her body rigid and unyielding. It was as if she were no longer human, but a part of the stone itself. Sarah could feel the cold, malevolent energy radiating from Emily, a chilling confirmation that the entity had taken hold, that it was actively consuming her. Is Emily lost to them, or can she be saved? The question screamed in Sarah's mind, a desperate, unanswered plea. She clung to the last vestiges of hope, a fragile thread in a world consumed by darkness. She would not give up on Emily, not yet. But she knew with a chilling certainty that time was running out. The Elder One was waking, and it was taking Emily with it. The horrifying spectacle of Emily's transformation, her desperate attempt to merge with the ancient stone, had galvanized Sarah. The time for scientific debate and cautious observation was over. Oakhaven was dying, its inhabitants succumbing to a madness that defied all rational explanation, and Emily, her friend, was being consumed by the very entity they had unearthed. Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that the only hope lay in the ancient text she had discovered in the hidden alcove of the town library. They spoke of rituals, of containment, of a way to keep the Elder One dormant. Armed with this desperate hope, Sarah returned to the library, her mind racing, her fingers fumbling through the brittle pages of the forbidden texts. The archaic language, once a barrier, now seemed to yield its secrets with a terrifying urgency. She focused on the passages that detailed the rituals of containment, the complex ceremonies designed to keep the Elder One slumbering beneath the earth. The text described intricate symbols, not unlike the spiral she had seen on the old maps, carved into stone and imbued with a strange, resonant power. They spoke of guttural chants, whispered under the pale moonlight, their vibrations designed to create a barrier, a seal against the entity's influence. And they spoke of offerings, of sacrifices made to appease the hungry void, to satiate its insatiable hunger and force it back into slumber. Sarah found evidence of these rituals in hidden carvings and forgotten alcoves beneath the church, remnants of a desperate struggle waged by the early settlers against an ancient cosmic horror. The symbols were faded, almost erased by time, but their power still resonated, a faint echo of a forgotten battle. She traced the intricate patterns with her fingertips, feeling a strange, almost electric current hum beneath her skin. The text hinted at a terrible sacrifice required to complete the ritual. The language was veiled, metaphorical, speaking of the offering of consciousness, of the willing surrender of self. At first, Sarah interpreted this as a symbolic act, a mental commitment to the ritual. But as she delved deeper, a chilling realization began to dawn on her. The sacrifices were not symbolic, they were literal. The journals detailed the slow, agonizing decline of those who had been chosen for the ritual. Their minds would unravel, their bodies would wither, their consciousnesses slowly absorbed by the Elder One. It was a horrifying price to pay, a desperate measure to keep the entity dormant. The text hinted that the rituals became more frequent, the offerings more demanding, as the Elder One stirred in its slumber. There were fragmented accounts of the great hunger, of the entity's influence spreading, its whispers growing louder. And then, abruptly, the ritual ceased. The journals ended, their final entries filled with a chilling sense of despair and resignation. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she pieced together the horrifying truth. The early settlers had been sacrificing their own to keep the Elder One at bay, and then they had stopped. Why? Had the price become too high? Had they simply run out of willing sacrifices? Or had the Elder One grown too powerful, its hunger too vast to be satiated by mere human offerings? The question hung in the dusty air of the library, a cold, chilling truth that threatened to shatter her last vestiges of hope. What was the sacrifice, and can it be replicated? The thought of offering another human life to this ancient horror was unthinkable. But if there was no other way, if Oakhaven was truly doomed, what choice did they have? The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her, a crushing burden that threatened to break her. She was no longer just a historian. She was a guardian of a terrible secret, a reluctant participant in a cosmic horror that had been unfolding for centuries. The Elder One's hunger became undeniable, a palpable force that permeated every corner of Oakhaven. It was no longer content with subtle whispers and fragmented visions. It was actively draining the life force from the town, leaving behind a landscape of desolation and despair. The vibrant green of the forest surrounding Oakhaven had withered, the leaves turning brittle and brown, crumbling to dust at the slightest touch. The once clear waters of the Oakhaven River had turned stagnant, a murky, foul-smelling sludge that reflected the sickly yellow of the sky. A pervasive sense of emptiness hung in the air, a chilling void that seemed to swallow all sound, all light, all hope. The townspeople, already gaunt and lifeless from the pervasive nightmares and collective hallucinations, were now mere husks, their bodies emaciated, their eyes wide and vacant, reflecting the pulsating light of the ancient stone. Their consciousnesses, once vibrant and unique, were slowly being absorbed by the Elder One, leaving behind only empty vessels, their minds lost to the entity's influence. They wandered the streets like automatons, their movements slow and deliberate, their faces devoid of all emotion. Sarah watched in horror as her world crumbled around her. The town she had come to study, to understand, was being devoured by something ancient and unspeakable. The people she had come to know, to care for, were becoming mere husks, their consciousnesses slowly being absorbed by the Elder One. She felt its tendrils reaching for her own mind, a cold, insidious presence that promised ultimate knowledge, infinite power, and eternal oblivion in exchange for her soul. It was a seductive whisper, a tempting offer that promised an end to the fear, an end to the struggle, an end to the pain. She fought it, clinging to the last vestiges of her sanity, but it was a losing battle. The entity is relentless, a constant, insidious presence that is slowly eroding her mind, piece by agonizing piece. She could feel its cold, hungry tendrils probing her thoughts, searching for weaknesses, for cracks in her resolve. It showed her visions of her deepest fears, of her failures, of her loneliness. It whispered promises of power, of understanding, of a release from the burden of her own consciousness. The physical manifestations of its hunger were becoming more frequent, more audacious. The ground beneath Oakhaven trembled constantly, a low, guttural rumble that resonated deep within her bones. Cracks appeared in the foundations of buildings, spreading like spiderwebs across the walls, threatening to swallow the town whole. The air grew colder, a biting chill that seeped into her bones, a cold that felt like the grave itself. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of tormented voices that threatened to shatter her sanity, to break her will. Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that time was running out. The Elder One was waking, and it was consuming Oakhaven, one soul at a time. Can Sarah resist its pull? Can she fight something that is not physical, something that exists only in the shadows and the static and the darkest corners of her mind? It was a battle she was destined to lose, a game she could not win. And the entity knew it. It reveled in her fear, in her despair, in her growing madness. It was a cruel, twisted game, and Oakhaven was its playground. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her, a crushing burden that threatened to break her. She was no longer just a historian. She was a guardian of a terrible secret, a reluctant participant in a cosmic horror that had been unfolding for centuries, and the fate of Oakhaven, and perhaps the world, rested on her shoulders. Desperate, Sarah knew she had to seek out Old Man Hemlock. He was the only one who seemed to possess any true understanding of the ancient horror that was consuming Oakhaven. His cryptic warnings, once dismissed as the ramblings of a reclusive eccentric, now resonated with a chilling truth. He was the last thread connecting them to the town's forgotten past, to the knowledge that might offer a glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness. She found his cabin nestled deep within the gnarled, ancient woods that bordered Oakhaven, a place the townspeople now avoided with a superstitious dread. The air here was different, cooler, and carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a stark contrast to the stagnant, oppressive atmosphere of the town. The cabin itself was dilapidated, its wooden walls warped and weathered, its windows dark and uninviting. But a faint wisp of smoke curled from its chimney, a sign of life in a world that felt increasingly dead. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing Old Man Hemlock. His face, a road map of wrinkles and sun-baked wisdom, was etched with a profound weariness, his eyes, usually clouded with age, now sharp and piercing as they fixed on Sarah. He seemed to have aged decades in the past few days, his body stooped, his movements slow and deliberate. "I knew you'd come," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He stepped aside, a silent invitation to enter. The interior of the cabin was a chaotic jumble of ancient artifacts, dusty books, and strange hand-drawn maps. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and something else, something metallic and ancient. He led her to a small wooden table, its surface covered with intricate carvings that mirrored the symbols Sarah had seen in the ancient texts. "I am the last," he began, his voice low and grave, his eyes fixed on the flickering flame of a single candle. "The last descendant of the original settlers. We were tasked with guarding the knowledge of the Elder One, with ensuring it remained dormant." He explained that his ancestors had discovered the Elder One centuries ago, a cosmic entity that had slumbered beneath the earth for eons, feeding on the fear and consciousness of those who lived above it. They had developed the rituals of containment, a complex series of symbols and chants designed to keep the Elder One dormant, to appease its hunger with offerings. "The sacrifice became too great," he confessed, his voice filled with a profound sorrow. "Too frequent. My ancestors, they used their own family members. A willing offering of consciousness, a surrender of self, to satiate its hunger and force it back into slumber." He showed Sarah a hidden chamber beneath his cabin, a small, dark space filled with ancient artifacts and a chilling family history. There were faded portraits of men and women, their eyes wide and vacant, their faces etched with a profound despair. Each portrait was accompanied by a date, a name, and a single chilling word: sacrifice. "I am the last one left," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "My family, they all gave themselves to keep it sleeping. And now it's waking up again." He offered himself as the final sacrifice, his eyes filled with a desperate, weary resignation. "It's my duty," he said, his voice firm. "My family's legacy. I will give myself to keep Oakhaven safe." But Sarah refused, her heart pounding in her chest. The thought of offering another human life to this ancient horror was unthinkable. There had to be another way. There had to be. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her, a crushing burden that threatened to break her. She was no longer just a historian. She was a guardian of a terrible secret, a reluctant participant in a cosmic horror that had been unfolding for centuries, and the fate of Oakhaven and perhaps the world rested on her shoulders. Old Man Hemlock's confession, delivered in the dim, flickering light of his cabin, had shattered Sarah's last vestiges of hope. The truth was far more horrifying than she could have imagined. The rituals of containment, the ancient chants, the intricate symbols, they were not merely symbolic acts of appeasement. They required a living, conscious mind to be willingly offered to the Elder One, a sacrifice to satiate its hunger and force it back into slumber. He explained the chilling mechanics of the sacrifice. It wasn't a physical death, not in the traditional sense. It was a complete and utter dissolution of the self, a merging of consciousness with the Elder One, a willing surrender of individuality to the cosmic entity. The victim's mind would unravel, their memories, their thoughts, their very essence absorbed into the vast, hungry void. Their body would remain a lifeless husk, their eyes wide and vacant, reflecting the pulsating light of the ancient stone. He confessed that his ancestors, driven by a desperate need to protect Oakhaven, had used their own family members as sacrifices. He showed her the faded portraits in the hidden chamber beneath his cabin, each one a testament to a life willingly given to keep the Elder One dormant. He spoke of the profound sorrow, the agonizing decisions, the terrible burden of a legacy built on sacrifice. He was the last one left, the final descendant of a lineage of guardians, and he was ready to fulfill his duty. "It's my duty," he repeated, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a desperate, weary resignation. "My family's legacy. I will give myself to keep Oakhaven safe. It's the only way." But Sarah refused, her heart pounding in her chest, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. The thought of offering another human life to this ancient horror was unthinkable. The image of Emily, her friend, slowly being consumed by the Elder One, was burned into her mind, a chilling reminder of the terrible price of this sacrifice. There had to be another way. There had to be. She argued with him, her voice raw with desperation. There has to be another way. We can't just sacrifice people. There has to be a loophole, a different interpretation of the texts, something. Old Man Hemlock listened patiently, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "The Elder One feeds on consciousness, Sarah," he explained, his voice gentle but firm. "It is a hungry void. It demands a willing offering. My ancestors tried other ways. They tried animal sacrifices, offerings of blood, of material wealth. Nothing worked. The hunger only grew. The madness only spread." He spoke of the terrible toll the sacrifices had taken on his family, the slow erosion of their sanity, the constant fear of being chosen, of being consumed. He spoke of the guilt, the despair, the profound loneliness of a life dedicated to guarding a cosmic horror. He was tired, so very tired, and he longed for the peace that only oblivion could offer. Sarah's mind raced, desperately searching for an alternative, a way to break the cycle of sacrifice. The ancient texts were clear. The Elder One fed on consciousness. But did it have to be human consciousness? Could there be another form of consciousness, a different kind of offering that could satiate its hunger? The question hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope in the encroaching darkness. She remembered a forgotten passage in the ancient texts, a cryptic verse that spoke of the collective mind, of the shared dream. Could it be possible? Could the collective consciousness of the townspeople, now mere husks, their minds lost to the entity's influence, be used as a temporary, non-lethal offering, a surge of energy to force the entity back into slumber? It was a desperate gamble, a long shot, but it was the only hope they had. Is there truly no other way to stop it? The question echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the terrible choice that lay before her. The fate of Oakhaven, and perhaps the world, rested on her shoulders, and she knew with a chilling certainty that time was running out. The Elder One was waking, and it was hungry. The guttural roar of the Elder One intensified, shaking the very foundations of Oakhaven. The pulsating violet stone, now a blinding malevolent beacon, throbbed with an almost unbearable intensity, casting grotesque, shifting shadows across the dig site. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the hum of the fluorescent lights growing louder, more intense, as if the very building was reacting to the struggle within. The metal walls of the units seemed to groan, to warp, as if struggling to contain the immense power of the entity. Under immense pressure, Sarah, Mark, and a now lucid but weakened Emily began to execute the complex ritual. Emily, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes now clear and focused, used her geological knowledge to pinpoint key energy points in the vast, intricate network of the violet stone. She moved with a desperate urgency, her fingers tracing the faint violet veins that pulsed beneath the earth, her voice a low murmur as she guided Mark to the precise locations. Mark, his scientific mind now fully engaged with the terrifying reality of their situation, meticulously prepared the ancient symbols, tracing them onto the cold, smooth surface of the stone with a mixture of awe and dread. He chanted the ancient words, his voice raw and trembling, but filled with a desperate resolve. The words, once meaningless sounds, now resonated with a strange, resonant power, vibrating through the very air, creating a barrier, a seal against the entity's influence. Sarah, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, focused on channeling the collective consciousness of Oakhaven's inhabitants into the pulsating rock. She closed her eyes, picturing the townspeople, their vacant eyes, their swaying bodies, their minds lost to the entity's influence. She reached out, not with her hands, but with her mind, connecting to their fragmented thoughts, their lost memories, their collective despair. It was a terrifying experience, a torrent of emotions and sensations that threatened to overwhelm her, but she held firm, her resolve unwavering. The entity thrashed, its roars shaking the very foundations of the town. The ground beneath them trembled violently, cracks appearing in the earth, spreading like spiderwebs across the dig site. The air grew colder, a biting chill that seeped into their bones, a cold that felt like the grave itself. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of tormented voices that threatened to shatter their sanity, to break their will. But they stood firm, their gazes fixed on the swirling darkness before them. They would not break. They would not yield. Emily, her body trembling, her strength fading, pointed to a final crucial energy point. Mark, his hand shaking, quickly traced the last symbol, his voice a desperate cry as he completed the final chant. Sarah, her mind stretched to its breaking point, channeled a final massive surge of collective consciousness into the stone, a desperate, primal scream of defiance against the ancient horror. The pulsating light from the rock intensified to an unbearable degree, a blinding flash of violet that illuminated the entire dig site, casting grotesque, shifting shadows across the trenches. The guttural roars of the Elder One reached a deafening crescendo, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The ground beneath them bucked and heaved, threatening to swallow them whole. Can they complete it before the Elder One consumes them all? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The fate of Oakhaven, and perhaps the world, rested on their shoulders, and they knew with a chilling certainty that time was running out. The Elder One was waking, and it was hungry, but they were fighting back, and they would not give up. Not now, not ever. The pulsating light from the rock intensified to an unbearable degree, a blinding flash of violet that illuminated the entire dig site, casting grotesque, shifting shadows across the trenches. The guttural roars of the Elder One reached a deafening crescendo, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality, a primal scream of ancient rage and frustration. The ground beneath them bucked and heaved, threatening to swallow them whole, the very earth groaning under the immense power of the entity. Then, abruptly, it ceased. The blinding light faded, the guttural roars died down to a low, almost imperceptible hum, and the oppressive weight that had been crushing them for weeks lifted, replaced by a hollow, aching emptiness. The ground beneath their feet stilled, the tremors subsiding, leaving behind only the faint rhythmic thrum of the ancient stone. The air, though still cold, lost its biting chill, and the whispers in their minds faded, replaced by a profound, almost deafening silence. Sarah, Mark, and Emily stood there trembling, their bodies exhausted, their minds reeling from the sheer intensity of the ritual. They had done it. They had forced the Elder One back into slumber, but the cost was immense. The townspeople, though still gaunt and lifeless, slowly began to stir. Their eyes, once wide and vacant, now held a flicker of awareness, a faint glimmer of their former selves returning. They looked around, bewildered, their faces etched with confusion and a deep, unsettling weariness. They were still husks, their minds scarred by the entity's influence, but they were no longer completely lost. The collective consciousness, channeled through the ritual, had served its purpose, providing a temporary satiation for the Elder One's hunger, forcing it back into its ancient slumber. Oakhaven was scarred. The buildings stood, but their foundations were cracked, their walls warped. The vibrant green of the forest had withered, the leaves, brittle and brown, crumbling to dust at the slightest touch. The once clear waters of the Oakhaven River had turned stagnant, a murky, foul-smelling sludge that reflected the sickly yellow of the sky. A pervasive sense of emptiness hung in the air, a chilling void that seemed to swallow all sound, all light, all hope. The dig site, once a place of scientific curiosity, was now a monument to their desperate struggle, a testament to the ancient horror that lay buried beneath. The trenches, once meticulously excavated, were now gaping maw, revealing vast sections of the pulsating violet stone, now dormant, its light a faint, almost imperceptible glow. Sarah, Mark, and Emily were hailed as heroes, but they carried the heavy burden of what they had witnessed, of what they had done. The victory was bittersweet. They had saved Oakhaven, but it would never be the same. Its inhabitants, though freed from the Elder One's direct influence, were forever changed, their minds scarred, their spirits broken. The true cost of this victory was immeasurable. The Elder One was back in slumber, but for how long? The ancient text hinted at a cyclical nature, of awakenings and slumberings, of a hunger that could never be truly extinguished. Sarah knew that their victory was temporary, a brief reprieve in an eternal struggle. The question that haunted her waking hours was chilling in its simplicity. What is the true cost of this victory? And when would the Elder One awaken again? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The slumber was not a cure, but a temporary bandage on a wound that would never truly heal. Months later, Oakhaven was slowly recovering, but it would never be the same. The scars of the Elder One's awakening were etched deep into the very landscape, a constant chilling reminder of the ancient horror that lay buried beneath. The strange rock formations remained, dormant but ever present, their faint violet glow a subtle pulse beneath the earth, a silent testament to the cosmic entity that had almost consumed the town. The townspeople, though freed from the Elder One's direct influence, were forever changed. Their eyes, once wide and vacant, now held a flicker of awareness. But it was a haunted awareness, a deep-seated weariness that spoke of unspeakable horrors witnessed and endured. They moved with a quiet solemnity, their laughter muted, their conversations hushed. The collective madness had receded, but a pervasive sense of unease lingered, a chilling echo of the whispers that had once filled the air. Sarah, Mark, and Emily were hailed as heroes, but they carried the heavy burden of what they had witnessed, of what they had done. The victory was bittersweet, a triumph tinged with profound sorrow and a chilling understanding of the fragile nature of reality. Mark, the pragmatic archaeologist, had found a new purpose. He dedicated his life to studying the violet stone, meticulously cataloging its properties, searching for any weakness, any vulnerability that could be exploited should the Elder One ever awaken again. His skepticism had been shattered, replaced by a grim, determined resolve to understand the ancient horror that had almost consumed them all. Emily, though still weakened by her ordeal, had found a strange, almost spiritual connection to the stone. She could feel its faint pulse, its dormant energy, a silent hum that resonated deep within her. She used her geological knowledge to monitor its activity, to detect any subtle shifts, any signs of reawakening. She was a living barometer, a sensitive instrument attuned to the ancient entity that lay sleeping beneath Oakhaven. Sarah, however, bore the heaviest burden. She had become the guardian of the Elder One's secrets, the keeper of the ancient texts, the reluctant heir to Old Man Hemlock's chilling legacy. She dedicated her life to ensuring it never awakened again, poring over the brittle journals, deciphering the archaic language, searching for any forgotten ritual, any lost knowledge that could strengthen the seal, that could prolong its slumber. She lived with a constant gnawing fear, a chilling certainty that their victory was temporary, a brief reprieve in an eternal struggle. The story ends not with a definitive resolution, but with a subtle, unsettling echo, a faint, rhythmic hum from deep within the earth, a sound that only Sarah, Emily, and Mark can hear, a reminder that some things only sleep, they never truly die. It's a sound that promises a future of constant vigilance, of unending dread, of a battle that will never truly be won. Oakhaven was safe, for now. But the world, oblivious to the horror that had almost consumed a small, unremarkable town, remained utterly unprepared, and Sarah knew with a chilling certainty that one day the Elder One would awaken again, and when it did, she would be waiting, forever vigilant, forever haunted,